Hello, I'm Brian Vermeer, and welcome to today's episode of the 12 Myths of Christmas. We're gearing up toward the end now. We're getting into some real serious information here. For today and the next two episodes, which should be out on Monday and Tuesday, we're actually going to be looking at the biblical accounts of what happened when Jesus was born. Now, I told you yesterday that today's video may have some information that will surprise you. So what I want you to do is think about Jesus' birth. Think about the Nativity. And what is it that you picture? Do you picture a scene something like this, where Mary and Joseph are in a stable with some animals around and maybe a few shepherds? Sometimes you might see the wise men there, but they're just kind of out, maybe out of town by themselves, and it's night. And this is the image that we often get. Sometimes even we have the star shining above, the stable. What we're going to do today is take a look at this passage where it describes Jesus being born and see what does the Bible say, and probably more importantly, what does it not say about the birth of Jesus. And we're going to find that a lot of the information that we think is either kind of misguided a little or possibly outright wrong. So, I'm not trying to destroy any of your faith. I just want to read the Bible, tell you what the Bible says, and we'll interpret it and see what actually happened on the day that Jesus was born. Now, the only passage that describes the actual birth of Jesus is in the book of Luke. Luke was a doctor who traveled with the Apostle Paul. He was not Jewish himself. He was a Gentile, which gives him a unique perspective on the life of Christ. He wrote the book of Luke. He also then wrote the book of Acts as a sequel, where he describes what the apostles did after Jesus was resurrected and went back to heaven. Luke probably got this information about the birth of Jesus from Mary herself. Luke, being a Gentile, did not necessarily have the Jewish stigma against women. He would not have had a problem interviewing a woman and getting her point of view as to what happened. So that's why Luke is probably the only gospel that actually describes the birth of Christ, because, Mary was one of the ones who was there and would have been able to tell him what happened. And since Luke traveled with the Apostle Paul and traveled through Europe, we know that Mary, after Jesus' resurrection, the Apostle John took her to live with him in the city of Ephesus. And Luke traveled through Ephesus, probably, many times in his life. So he would have had several opportunities to meet her and talk to her. So let's just take a look at Luke chapter 2 and see what it says about the birth of Jesus. This is a very familiar passage. Some of you may have read this many times. Some of you may have memorized it. I'll be reading this out of the Holman Christian Standard Version, but if you have other versions that it's just as well. So, in Luke chapter 2, starting in verse 1, it says, "In those days a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that the whole emperor should be registered. This first registration took place while Quirinius was governing Syria." Okay, Caesar Augustus, we know, was the nephew of Julius Caesar. His original name was Octavian. He was the first Roman emperor. And during his time, there was a long period of peace called the Pax Romana, which is actually when Jesus was born. He was born during this period of time. Now it says he issued a decree that the whole empire should be registered. Doesn't necessarily mean taxed. It doesn't specifically say that they were paying taxes. He was taking a census, is what he was doing. He was trying to find out how many people lived in each province of the Roman Empire. Now, it's very possible that they paid taxes during this time as well, but it does not specifically say that that was the purpose of the registration. However, we do know from other censuses that were taken of the empire, that is one of the reasons why they did it. Now notice it says this first registration took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. For a long time, scholars said, well, see, that shows that the Bible is wrong, because Quirinius, the census that happened while Quirinius was governing Syria, took place in the year AD 6, which is about 10 to 12 years after Jesus was born. Well, notice also that Luke specifically says this first registration took place when Quirinius was governing Syria. One of the things that scientists or that archaeologists have discovered is that Quirinius actually governed the province of Syria, and the province of Syria was just one of the Roman provinces that the empire was divided into. It kind of covered what today is the nations of Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and Jordan. And Quirinius actually governed this province twice. And the first time was during the time that Jesus was born. So it's possible that there was a Roman census during that time. And that's why Luke says the first census, as opposed to the second census that happened about 10 to 12 years later. So here we see archaeology again backing up what the Bible says. And then in verse 3 it says, so everyone went to be registered, each to his own town. Some people say, why in the world would they make people, travel like that? It's possible what this simply means is everyone had to go to the town in which they were born. And that's, if there were any records of births, that would be, probably where they were. So this is not entirely unreasonable. It's entirely possible that they would make people go back to their towns, to their hometowns, or the towns that their families came from. That way they could register whole families together, maybe. So we see that this gives the impetus for Joseph and Mary to go to Bethlehem. He's actually fulfilling prophecy, because we know the prophet Micah said that the Messiah would be born in Bethlehem, but Mary and Joseph lived in Nazareth, which was some distance away. So, in verse 4, and Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and family line of David. And if you read the book of Matthew, chapter 1, you see actually Joseph's family tree traced all the way back through David, eventually all the way back to Abraham. Jews were very strict about genealogies. That's something they like to keep up with. They wanted to know who their ancestors were. They specifically wanted to know what tribe each one was from, but they were really big into what their ancestors were. So in Matthew chapter 1, we see where Matthew did the research and was able to trace Joseph's family tree all the way back to Abraham. So we know he was a descendant of David, which also is a fulfillment of prophecy. Jesus is the rightful king of Israel through his father, through his adoptive father, if you want to call it that, his legal father, Joseph. It says in verse 5, to be registered along with Mary, who was engaged to him and who was pregnant. So he took Mary with him, and they traveled from Galilee, which is in northern Israel, down to Bethlehem, which is in the section of Israel called Judea. And Judea, by the way, actually comes from the name the tribe of Judah, which first occupied that land. And that is where we actually get the word Jew, from Judah and Judea. So they traveled from Nazareth to Judea. Now, in the movies, we always see them, Mary riding a donkey, Joseph walking. We see them going through the desert all by themselves, usually at night. I've even seen some where they have them going through a sandstorm. The truth most likely is that Mary and Joseph were with a caravan, because there would have been a lot of people traveling at this time. So they most likely joined a caravan, and the distance from Nazareth to Bethlehem, a healthy man could walk that in about one day. So if a caravan was traveling, they may have been going a little slower. They probably only had to spend one night on the road. The caravan would have offered them safety. They were not by themselves, most likely. They were traveling with a bunch of other people who were going to Judea. They would have been passing a bunch of people going from Judea up to Galilee. So there wasn't a lot of concern about safety here. And they most likely did not travel at night. And if they had to spend the night on the road, it was probably only one night because it really is not that far. Like I said, an average person could walk it in a single day. But it does say that Mary was pregnant. The King James says she was great with child. So it probably took them, maybe 2 days, to get there instead of the one day. But certainly not, they weren't on the road for weeks or anything like that. And it was probably a very uneventful trip. So they traveled to Bethlehem, and now this is where it starts getting interesting. And this is where what we see in the movies is probably very different from what actually happened. Let's look then at verse 6. While they were there, the time came for her to give birth. For some reason, the movies always have Mary and Joseph arriving in Bethlehem just as she's starting to go into labor. I don't know why they do that. All it says in the Bible is that while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. They could have been in Bethlehem for months. We really don't know how long they were in Bethlehem. And we'll talk about this, in a second, as far as how long they could have been there. But it just says while they were there. So Mary and Joseph had time to find a place to stay, and she gave birth while they were there. So it could have been days later, it could have been weeks later. We really don't know. But for some reason, the movies, for dramatic effect, always like to have Mary seemingly going into labor just as they're arriving in Bethlehem at nightfall or in the middle of the night or something like that. Again, they would have only traveled during the day. They would have arrived in Bethlehem probably around noon or early afternoon. And she was probably not going into labor at the time. It does say she was great with child, but that just means she was pregnant. It does not necessarily mean she was very pregnant. It does not necessarily mean that her time was already there. So we don't know how long it was. The Bible does not say. And then in verse 7 it says, Then she gave birth to her firstborn son, wrapped him snugly in cloth, and laid him in a feeding trough or a manger, because there was no room for them at the inn. And there is so much that we can get out of this verse. First of all, it says she gave birth to her firstborn son. The Greek actually says she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. This is another reason why, when I talked yesterday about Jesus being an only child, this is another reason why I don't believe Jesus was an only child, because it says she gave birth to her firstborn. And if she had a firstborn, if it specifically calls him a firstborn, then it's very likely she had a secondborn, a thirdborn, and so on. Now, those that believe that Jesus was the only child of Mary say, well, of course he was her firstborn because he was her only born. But to me, it just seems a weird way. You would not normally call someone's only child their first child. I have only one child myself, and I don't go around telling people this is my firstborn. If anything, I say, she's my only child. Usually I just say she's my child, my daughter. I might say she's my only child, but I'm not going to say she's my first child. Because when you say first, people are going to imply that you have a second. So this also kind of backs up the fact that Jesus was Mary and Joseph's first child and that they had more afterwards. It says she gave birth to her firstborn son. She wrapped him snugly in cloth. The King James says in swaddling clothes. That simply means she wrapped him in strips of cloth. This was normally the way you would wrap a baby at that time to keep them from kicking around too much. I describe it. I've seen babies wrapped up like this before, and I've described it as, she wrapped him up all like a little burrito, something like that. She wrapped cloths around him, and it says she laid him in a manger. Now, this is the only reason that we have to believe that Jesus was born in a stable. Nowhere else in the Bible does it say anything about Jesus being born in a stable. Now, when I was studying this passage back, I think it was when I was in high school, I started wondering, why did Mary and Joseph have to go to a stable? Why, for that matter, did they even have to go to an inn to spend their time in Bethlehem? Because let's go back to what it says. Why were they going to Bethlehem to start with? They went to Bethlehem because that's where Joseph's family was from. It's entirely possible that's where Joseph was born. Joseph most likely had family living in Bethlehem. Now, when I was a kid, when we went on vacations, we always stayed with family. So why wouldn't Mary and Joseph simply have stayed with Joseph's family? Well, it turns out, believe it or not, Jesus most likely was not born in a stable. Jesus most likely was born in a house very likely belonging to Joseph's family members. Now, how do we know that? We know that from this word, in. This is a classic example of the original Greek word being translated incorrectly when they first translated the Bible into English. And for some reason, every translation since then, at least most translations since then, have just continued that tradition. The Greek word that is translated in is actually the word kataluma, and it does not mean an inn, as in a hotel. This word is used another place in the book of Luke. If you look at Luke chapter 22, verse 11, we see this same word, kataluma, describing the place where it said there was no room for Mary and Joseph. We see the same word in Luke 22, chapter 11, or verse 11, where it says Jesus is telling his disciples to find the place to have the Last Supper. And he says, "Tell the owner of the house, the teacher asks you, where is the guest room where I can eat the Passover with my disciples?" In this verse, the word kataluma is translated guest room. And that is actually what the word means. It means guest room or upper room. So the way Luke 2 should actually be translated is, she wrapped him in cloth and laid him in a feeding trough because there was no room for them in the guest room. So let's think about this. This is actually a very logical scenario. Mary and Joseph arrive in Bethlehem. They're going to stay with Joseph's family. Joseph's family has probably several relatives coming to stay with them. So there's going to be quite a few people staying in this one house. So the guest room was already full. And there wasn't room for Mary and Joseph to stay in the guest room with the other family members, where she would have laid him in a bed. So instead, they had to stay in the front portion of the house where the animals would have been kept. A Jewish house at that time was divided into several sections. One section was a lower section, which is where you would have kept the animals, and that's where you would have found a manger. Then on a raised platform a little bit, you would have had the kitchen and living area. And then if the family was able to afford it, they would have built onto that a guest room, a kind of room with some more beds in it, which is where either the family would have slept or where they would have put guests if they were entertaining others. And that's what the word kataluma actually means. It refers to that guest room or that upper room. Again, the same word that Jesus used to describe the room where he had the Last Supper. And we certainly aren't going to say, Jesus had the Last Supper at an inn. That's not what, we see here. So, now, how else do we know that that's the correct translation? Well, if we look in Luke chapter 10, in the parable of the Good Samaritan, in Luke chapter 10, verse 34, Jesus is telling the parable of the Good Samaritan. And in verse 34, he says, he went over to him and bandaged his wounds. And just in case you're interested, the word for wounds there is trauma. It's where we get our word trauma. Pouring on oil and wine. Then he put him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. So here we see Luke using the word inn. Now, this is the same author that wrote about the birth of Christ. And in this verse, he does not use the word kataluma to mean inn. In this verse, he uses the word pandokaion, which does mean hotel or inn. So if Mary and Joseph were actually looking for an inn or a hotel in Luke chapter 2, this is the word that Luke would have used. But instead, he uses the word kataluma. So why is it translated in Luke chapter 2 if that's not what it means? Well, I don't know all the history of biblical translations. The English translations that we have came from a variety of sources. Some were from the original Greek, some were from the Latin Vulgate. Just like I said earlier about, for some reason, John Wycliffe, when he translated from Greek to English, somehow he turned the name Jacob into James, and we don't know why. But somewhere, when someone translated the Bible from the Greek into the English, in Luke chapter 2, instead of saying, because there was no room for them in the guest room, which is what the Greek actually says, he put there was no room for them in the inn. And then the King James writers just followed suit. And since the King James became so popular, every translation since then has just kind of followed suit. There are a couple of translations that do correctly say because there was no room for them in the guest room or in the upper room. So I hope I haven't shattered, your vision of the first Christmas. But the truth is, Mary and Joseph came to Bethlehem with a caravan of travelers. They probably arrived about mid-afternoon. They went to a house where Mary and Joseph stayed with Joseph's relatives, so there probably were quite a few people around when Jesus was born. And since there wasn't room for them, they may have arrived a little later than everybody else. All the beds were taken in the guest room, so there wasn't room for them in the guest room. So instead, they had to stay in the living area in the front of the house. And the only place then to put the new baby would have been in the animal's feeding trough. Most families had a few animals at that time. They had a cow for milk. They've had a few sheep to get wool to make their clothes, and so on. So it's very likely that that house had some animals and would have had a manger. But the idea of Jesus being born in a stable or a cave, to be honest, is probably not what actually happened. It makes a good picture, I know. It makes a beautiful scene. But unfortunately, that's probably not what really happened. Now, again, I'm not telling you what to believe. None of this is going to affect your salvation with God. None of this is going to determine whether or not you go to heaven. You believe what you want to believe. If you want to believe he was born in a stable out in the middle of nowhere with Mary and Joseph by themselves on the very first night they arrived in Bethlehem, you go ahead and believe that. I'm just telling you what the Bible says, what it does not say, and according to what it says, Jesus was most likely born in a house surrounded by Joseph's family, and there would have been nothing really remarkable about the birth itself. To me, that seems fitting, that the Messiah would come into the world unannounced to the general population. Now, to Monday, we're going to be looking at the first visitors that we know of that came to see Jesus, which were the shepherds. And we're going to see again, what does the Bible actually say and what does it not say? And we're going to compare that passage with similar biblical passages and try to get a better idea of what actually occurred on that night. So stay tuned for that. Please watch my Sunday school lesson this week. I'm going to be talking about Luke chapter 2 again, and that discussing why we can experience joy during this Christmas season, even though we've had a horrible year. So stay tuned for that. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel if you haven't already. Follow the Facebook page. They're both called Mr. Vermeer's Class. So look for Mr. Vermeer's Class channel on YouTube. Look for the Mr. Vermeer's Class on Facebook if you haven't done either one of those. Please like, follow, share. Let's get a lot of people watching this. Let's get a lot of subscribers. I think what I'm doing is something that God, wants me to do. So please share this channel, share this information, share these videos. And I'll see you again on Monday. So thanks for watching.